All right, let's get some insight from the experts. And joining us virtually, we have Dr. Hassan Kanenje, who is the director of the Horn Institute. And we're also joined in studio by Anwar Abdifatah Bashir, who is executive director of the East African Institute for Peace and Governance. Good to have you in studio this evening. While it's in contest that the Jubaland forces, I believe they're called what, Davish forces, have crossed into Kenya, and whether or not they pose a threat, what is not in contest is that there is some fighting happening across the border. Perhaps you can give us some context of what is happening in Jubaland.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Regarding on the subject matter, I think there has been a conflict between the Somali federal government and Jubaland state for the last 1 year and a half. But the current conflict is leading by a guy called Shannon, who's a general, and he created another conflict within Jubaland state, especially the Gedo region. So at the first time, there was a heated conflict between Fila Somalia and Jubaland, especially President Ahmed Obe, and there was a Bircheh conflict, which was Waterloo, and was defeated by the federal force at that moment. So this one is another trial to at least destabilize in Jubaland. So that's the context currently. And the government is using this notorious Abdirashid Janan to destabilize Jubaland. And he's acting that he's fighting against the administration in Kismayo.
Why would they be seeking to destabilize Jubaland? You mean the federal government of Somalia?
Yes. Now the current federal president, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, it's not the first time that he went a conflict with Jubaland, but his first term in 2013, he started like this kind of conflict in order to get some political gains, but he failed at that moment drastically. So now Hassan Sheikh 2.0 is also employing that kind of policies which didn't work before, and now it's not working for him again.
2.0 is who, Farmajo?
No, I'm talking about Hassan.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's hear from you, Dr. Kanenje. Kenya has had a relationship with Jubaland, I believe, since Kismayo was captured. Perhaps you can give us some context on how has the relationship been? Was it a relationship of convenience?
Yeah, you know, Kismayo is an important region in Somalia, but also it's a region that, of course, borders Kenya, which makes it important, you know, not just to the Kenyan government, but generally to the regional campaign when it comes to, you know, fighting terror, considering that, you know, Jubaland was also once really a fertile ground, you know, for Al-Shabaab, where they had established massive presence. Now, increasingly, what we have seen is there's been engagement between Nairobi and Mogadishu. And so the relationship, I think, needs to be understood within the context, one, of the relation that exists with the federal government in Mogadishu. But at the same time, the kind of challenges that, of course, emanate from federal member states, such as what we are seeing in Jubaland right now. And we understand that, you know, Kenya has had its men and women in uniform operating in some of these theaters for a very long time as part of the African, you know, Union, you know, peacekeeping missions. And so to the extent that perhaps, you know, it's looked at, you know, to the exclusion of, I think, the state of Somalia probably is going to be a mistake. We understand that there's been a lot of political hyperbole over perhaps what may be seen as a relationship, you know, that excludes Mogadishu, but actually that's not exactly the case. It's just some of the realities that exist on the ground that, you know, first of all, it is important to pay attention to what is happening closer home, as well as, you know, working with the recognized government, of course, in Mogadishu to ensure that. But I think one of the things that I think has provoked a lot of this debate is because of the uneasy relations that has existed, especially between the federal government as well as federal member states. But in Kenya's interest, and I think regional countries, what has become apparent is that they're interested in maintaining one Somalia, and not exactly, trying to balkanize it. Now, that does not mean they do not, of course, also deal with some of the peculiar, perhaps, interests of federal member states, which are part of the Somali constitution. And I think that is provided for. But so this should actually be understood within that framework of not mutually exclusive, aspects of federal member states and the federal government, but as part of actually dealing with the whole problem of instability in Somalia.
All right, so this is not the first time we're witnessing this. In 2020, there was conflict after Madobe was elected for the second time. There was an expectation that he would not run for a third time. He did so and won, I believe, in November last year. How much of this has to do with elections?
I think at macro level, since Somalia takes the federal system, there has been always a conflict between the center and the peripheries. But exclusively, Jubaland has been facing an isolated hostilities from Phil of Somalia in Mogadishu. So at that moment, the one you mentioned in 2020 was leading by the former president, Farmajo. So he had issues with the leadership of Jubaland. So at that moment, he employed to travel ban the officials, restriction of civilian movements, not giving the budget allocation for Jubaland. So now currently the same counterproductive policies is used by the current administration, which is leading by President Hassan Sheikh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's been debate around whether Madobe was constitutionally elected for a third term, but given there was a two-term limit, but then I read that the parliament changed the law on that. So how do we resolve that conflict?
I think it's not just exclusive to Ahmed Madobe, but if you look at the leaders of the federal member states, each one of them, they changed the constitution, they reviewed it, and they made a possibility that they can run for third or fourth times. So I think it's part of that issue, but also there is some isolated cases with it's exclusive to Jubaland and also Puntland regarding on the federal government. Somalia currently is federal member state as 6, including the newly established northeastern region. 3 of them are loyal to the federal government, not because they like the policies, but also they cannot survive without the support of the federal government in Mogadishu. But Jubaland and Puntland are relatively independent, relatively have resources, so that's why every government that takes the seat, they engage immediately a conflict with them. So the issue is beyond the constitutional review, is beyond a competition between and within the leaders of the federal member state. But also the macro level is, since Jubaland was established in 2013, there has been an isolated hostility emanating from the federal government. Hassan Sheikh 1.0, Farmajo, and the current administration, Hassan Sheikh 2.0. So that's a reality.
What is it, a power struggle?
Somehow it looks like a power struggle, but also there is an element of making them loyal 100% to Phil Somali, which they resist. Okay.
All right, Dr. Kanenje, where do Kenya and Ethiopia then come in? Because both of them are participating in the AU mission there, but in 2020, Kenya was viewed as being pro-Jubaland, and Ethiopia was viewed as being pro the federal administration.
Yes, Olive, in 2020, I think that was partly and largely actually informed by the internal politics what's going on in Somalia, especially in the light of the upcoming elections, which ended up again being postponed by the former President Farmajo. And I think Kenya became a convenient punching bag in that context. Now, it was also at a time when there was, really lack of consensus within Somalia itself. Remember, as Anwar has underscored, there is a lot of tension between sometimes the centers and the periphery. Now, unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is also a reflection of actually, the disagreement over the upcoming election, in which, for instance, at least, some member states such as Puntland and Jubaland, they have not exactly agreed to the kind of framework that's being suggested from the center. Now, that is something that, Somalia itself, of course, has to solve, and no one can be able to interfere in that internal dynamic. What, of course, countries such as Kenya or Ethiopia can do is simply to support efforts towards reconciliation, but also to ensure that there's an agreement or consensus, because Somalia's stability is extremely important to both Kenya and Ethiopia. And so there are no outside any stated, arrangements or positions by both governments. I think any other thing will be mere speculation, because things as they stand right now, it appears, at least those of us outside, that both, Nairobi in particular and Addis Ababa, they're keen to ensuring that there is, a united Somalia, especially considering, in fact, in the light of the agreement or that was arranged or rather reached after the Turkish mediation, following the disagreement over the MOU, with Somaliland. And so what is out there today, it's actually a recognition of that unitary, Somalia. Of course, that does not exclude the reality is that, sometimes you're having regional countries deal with certain aspects of federal member states, both from Somaliland, all through to Jubaland as well as others.
All right. So, Dr. Kanenje, lastly from you, what then does this mean for the war against Al-Shabaab?
I think Al-Shabaab must be celebrating where they are, and they're having a pretty good day, in fact, this past week or so, in part because any time there is a chasm or there's divisions or an appearance of conflict between federal member states and the federal government in Somalia, then Al-Shabaab can only win. And so it is extremely disturbing, especially in the light of the increased funding, to the awesome mission, but also decreasing interest in trying to support the Somalia's effort to stabilize, as well as bridge the gap that exists between federal member states and federal government. And so the fight against Al-Shabaab is only going to be made more complicated as a result of these kind of conflicts. However, there is still light at the end of the tunnel, and I think regional countries, including Kenya, have a role, as well as Ethiopia and IGAD, to play in trying to, calm, and reduce the temperatures that have contributed to this kind of conflagration.
All right. And lastly for you, Anwar, what do you make of this statement by Joshua Meservey, Senior Fellow, Hudson Institute? He appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And this is what, earlier this year, and this is what he said: state building in Somalia is a failed experiment. Clan remains the fundamental ordering principle of Somalia's society, making a strong central government unworkable. Yet Washington has spent over a decade trying to make just such a system work in Mogadishu. Instead, Washington should work directly with those federal member states and other sources of authority that are friendly and have enough legitimacy and competence to degrade Al-Shabaab.
Before I respond to that question, let me also second Professor Hassan on Al-Shabaab revival in some regions in the country, especially Middle Shabelle, not because of they are getting stronger and stronger, but because of the government from the two levels are engaged unnecessary conflicts. So that's where they're benefiting, and they are getting stronger and stronger. To come to the last question, I heard and also I read it, the statement, but I didn't accept it as it is, and I reject it as a statement, and it reflects the long-standing U.S. policy of dual-track policy and balkanization. But if the current federal government persists, it is unilateral decisions, including revision of the Constitution, unilateral electoral commission, and so on, then as a last result, that statement will be inevitable. And not only Washington, but also other international partners should deal with differently the center and the peripheries.
All right, so you're saying ultimately consensus is the best way forward. All right, I want to thank my guests. In studio, we had Anwar Abdifatah Bashir, who is Executive Director of the East African Institute for Peace and Governance. And joining us virtually, we've had Dr. Hassan Kanenje, who is the Director of the Horn Institute. We take a break, but Citizen Weekend continues on the other side.